Hello, friends. Welcome to the Nexus Podcast. I'm your host, James Dice. Each week, I fire questions at the leaders of the smart buildings industry to try to figure out where we're headed and how we can get there faster without all the marketing fluff. I'm pushing my learning to the limit, and I'm so glad to have you here following along. This episode is a conversation with Drew DePriest, Facility Management Technology Lead at CBRE, and Kat West, Vice President Sustainability at JLL. We walk through a day in the life of a digitized and decarbonized building. What are its major features? What challenges are there? Where can technology help? And what are the major themes that come up throughout that fictional day and in our transition to it as an industry? So without further ado, please enjoy the Nexus Podcast with Drew DePriest and Kat West. Welcome to the Nexus Podcast. It's great to have you guys on. Drew, can we start with you? Can you introduce yourself?
Sure thing. James, thanks for having us both. My name is Drew DePriest. I've been in this industry for almost 20 years, right out of my undergraduate career. I'm currently working at CBRE. I'm a facilities management technology lead. So a lot of the things that you've talked about on the podcast that you get into with the Nexus sessions are right up my alley, very much my jam. So I'm one of those longtime listeners, first time caller type deals. So happy to be here, happy for what I think is going to be a dynamic conversation. And we've all agreed that we're not just going to head nod to everything that everybody says here, which is going to be fun.
Awesome. Let's go into your background first before we bring on Kat. Can you talk about how you got all your roles before CBRE?
Sure thing. So coming out of undergrad, I did a bachelor's degree in systems engineering, and I was a web developer at the time. This was 20 years ago.
Oh, wow.
The internet was barely a thing. Google had just rolled out PageRank. We still had Ask Jeeves and Yahoo Maps and all kinds of everything else. So I never really found anything that I was at a crossroads coming out of undergrad. Do I go become like a full engineer and design things, or do I go off and try to build websites? And the web had just crashed in the late 90s. So oddly enough, control systems and BMS were the first thing I found that really combined both of those things. So excuse me, I get very much into, I was on top of a ladder. I was programming VAVs and chiller plants straight out of college and was building, we were a Tritium and Honeywell and Reliable shop in the old days. So I was building the actual user interface on top. So for me at the time, I was a kid in a candy store. It was great. So I stayed in that space for about 12 years, worked my way up to a regional spot within Automated Logic or ALC, decided to have some fun and took a little side journey to a startup company called Building Robotics, whose flagship product at the time was what's now the global behemoth known as Comfy. It was acquired by Siemens in 2018. From there, so that took me from kind of above the ceiling to down to above the desk in terms of workplace technology. Mm-hmm. And from there, pivoted into a workplace tech role at Aon. So I was managing anything at a desk, anything in a conference room, and then anything like this that people use to collaborate digitally. And that was my team. We owned all of it from a tech perspective. From there, rolled into CBRE. I spent my first couple of years here on our host digital platform, expanded it out to broader digital workplace, IoT, mobile access, kind of all of the buzzwords that we all talk about, and have been very fortunate to join a global technology account about 9 months ago. So have had one of those kind of once in a decade, once in a career projects to work on, which has been super exciting. And that brings us to today.
Cool. Very cool. Such a diverse background. And you joined us last week. Also, when this comes out, it won't be last week, but while we're recording this, it was last week for our Nexus Foundation's career planning workshop, which was super fun. And the reason I wanted to have you on is because you've had all of these different perspectives, which are so cool. I'd love to hear, are you distant enough from the Comfy situation where you can talk about it at this point?
Yeah, and I have nothing but positive, fond memories. I mean, the crew that I worked with from 2016 to 2018, like that's one of my bars now for just a great group of just good humans who were brilliant and willing to try new things, even if the world is saying, hey, we're not ready for this yet. So absolutely.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering what your general experience was. It sounds like you answered it. It sounds like a pretty cool. You came on. You weren't a founder. You came on after the product team had the product developed. You came on in the business development role, I think, and then you went through the
Correct.
acquisition.
So I came on post. It was one of the rounds of funding. It was the $12 million round, the A or the B. And I was in business development. I was calling on just anybody that we could get a hold of really at the time. And this was, so, oh my goodness, almost 6 years ago now. And to think about the contrast then, I'd get in a room with a facility manager or a chief engineer, and we'd tell them what we wanted to do. Like, we want to put your building, connect it to the internet, and then let anybody kind of nudge it one way or the other for their own personal comfort. And it was, sometimes we'd have a bet of like, how long before someone says, are you serious? Like, There were some who would just straight wouldn't engage the conversation. Like, no, that's absurd. That will never happen. And then, here we are 6 years later, and that ecosystem has exploded. So I still keep in good touch with a lot of my teammates from those days. Yeah, it was just a fun time, and it's cool to see the industry has come so far ever since.
Yeah, and just thinking about 6 years ago, the concept of what I call advanced supervisory control, controls coming from the cloud, still hasn't taken off. And yet there is this one use case, this one application that's been doing it, been around for a long time and has achieved scale and that kind of thing. So it's just a cool story to point back to, I bet.
Oh yeah, no, it was, when I first saw it, it struck me as one of the most forward-looking, innovative things I'd ever seen. And then once I went to work there and really got to see it under the hood, it was like, yeah, this is a very, very unique, once in a very long time place, technology and place to be. And to your point, like it's held true. We still have a long way to go at that level, but I'm proud to have been at that place somewhat early.
Yeah, I think sometime we should bring all the founders together and like talk about all the stumbling blocks, but that's a different conversation. I did want to bring in Kat here. So Kat, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, James. So great to be here. Also, long-time listener, first-time participant. So I studied environmental law at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and was able to run the environmental club there. We did a lot of work on recycling and bothered some of the facility building engineers about why aren't these LEED certified buildings. We improved recycling. We bought wind energy offsets or renewable energy certificates for Earth Day and some of the major events like Homecoming. We really liked to educate people about sustainability, make it easy and fun. We would have people write letters to their congressperson, and we didn't want to be hypocritical, so we offset our energy use with renewable energy certificates. Then when it came time to graduate, I contacted the salesperson who was selling us the renewable energy certificates, and I said, could you give me some paper made with wind energy so I can put my resume on it? And this gentleman said, no, just come work for me. So that's how I got my first job in sustainability, working for a renewable energy certificate seller. I would go to farmers markets and town festivals selling renewable energy to individual consumers for about like $7-10 extra a month, and sell to mayors of small towns in Connecticut. There was a really cool program where if 100 people paid for a little bit extra for renewable energy on their electric bill, their town got a 1 kilowatt solar array to put on any town building. So it was a really good public-private partnership that got people in the towns really motivated. I was working for that company, and they said, we're headquartered in Norcross, Georgia, so could you move down here? And I packed up what could fit in my 81 cubic foot Toyota Corolla and just came on down to Atlanta, Georgia, where I've been the director of sustainability for JLL. I had a point there where I worked for Sterling Planet, the renewable energy certificate company, and really, really enjoyed that, working on carbon offsets and greenhouse gas emissions accounting. But I felt I got a little bit bored, and my coworker shouted over the cubicle that he was studying for his lead green associate exam. So I went ahead and did that too, and then ended up working for this commissioning and engineering company called Energy Ace.
Okay.
That was awesome. So I worked there before coming to my home at JLL, where I've been for 7 years. I started at JLL to work on the Braves Stadium, which was really fun. So I work on a lot of like ground up new construction, tenant fit outs, green leasing standards, and I get really passionate about integrative design. So working with the architects and engineers to make a building that works for the facilities managers and the occupants, so it's a place that people can thrive.
Got it. And what's your current role at JLL, and what, because JLL is a big massive company. Can you talk about like what your group does specifically?
Certainly. I'm on the project development services team, and I'm a vice president of sustainability, the director in the Southeast. So I lead a team of 10 individuals working on ESG strategy
on new construction,
specific buildings.
Yeah, very cool. And how did you guys meet? The two of you sort of came to me with this concept of a podcast. And how did you guys come together?
I researched this. I looked into my LinkedIn messages, and Drew was posting a lot of really cool Internet of Things or indoor air quality sensor posts. And I reached out to him because that's something I'm interested in.
Yeah, right. It's the classic, the Web 2.0 generation of you start interacting with a lot of interesting people. For me, it's been a lot of LinkedIn, a lot of Twitter. And then over time, like, oh, well, Kat's talking about the same things that I am and has a different perspective on things. So it'd be really cool to convert kind of the social friends into in real life friends. And here we are.
Nice. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is overall ESG and sustainability. So I very much feel that was my calling in my career. I had someone come visit me when I was a senior. I was in a sustainable energy course, and I was like, I have no idea what I want to do for my career, but I know it's in this direction, right? And then someone came and spoke, and she came from a mechanical contractor, and I was like, okay, I guess I'll go that direction within this overall umbrella. I'd love to hear from you guys. Like, it sounds like Kat, we'll start with you. It was similar. You were in college and that you knew that was the direction you wanted to head. Do I have that right? And how did you get into buildings specifically?
Yes, well, I remember sitting in my college library like it was yesterday, and I had read the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, and then saw a trailer for An Inconvenient Truth all while I was about to write a paper for my environmental law class.
So you just had an existential crisis.
Yeah, I wrote this 17-page paper where I quoted Nelly, "It's getting hot in here," and I got an A+, and I just said, this is the universe telling me I need to go into sustainability. And okay. the buildings I like because it's a physical manifestation of our values. So we're taking our money and putting it somewhere that you can see. If somebody has a building that is truly net zero and set up to have composting, electric vehicle charging, bike racks that really protect your bike, showers so that people can shower after they bike to work. To me, it's a physical manifestation of the fact that you care about your employees, you want to do what's right for the environment. And I just love taking that abstract concept and putting it into something real that you can touch.
That's so well said. Drew, what's your motivation? How do you sort of, I mean, you said you kind of stumbled into, okay, this is a technology I'm interested in. Where did the sustainability piece come in for you?
I think from me, after the first year of just being a BMS field tech, starting to really learn the core philosophy of, for me, it was a challenge. How do you find that balance between how low can we drive energy consumption while also keeping a building comfortable and habitable such that people will continue to go there. And after a while, you just kind of understanding, that's the perpetual balance that we find ourselves in. And over time, that's evolved to get to a place where, especially the last probably 5 or 6 years, we're really leaning hard into the human side, but still very much mean, even in the short time I feel like I've been in the industry, the advances in how we're operating a building, we're getting down almost as far as we can go from just a physics perspective of how many kilowatt hours and BTUs can you just wring out of a building. So for me, it's just always been this. It's a fun, purposeful challenge of, here's something we can control on the demand side. How much further can we take it? And it all kind of wraps into a lot of the things that I know Kat works on to really, kind of paint the full picture moving forward.
Yeah, and that challenge or that puzzle, I view it kind of like a puzzle. How do we make this happen in every building long term? It feels a lot like, to me, like there's plenty of runway here to stay in this problem for a really long time. Is that how you guys feel too?
I think so. The opportunity is certainly big, and it's pressing. From a motivation perspective, you always hear about, if you want people to act and do something, give them a hard deadline and a finite scope.
Yeah.
We certainly do. Things are changing very quickly.
Kat, what about you?
Yeah, that's where I'm excited to see how we achieve net zero, because a lot of buildings are attempting to generate all of the power that they use with on-site solar panels. And to do that, you have to analyze the data about things like plug loads, how much ventilation and heating and cooling load is on the building. And Drew, I liked how you referenced Ask Jeeves, because I remember using Ask Jeeves back in the day, and then I would code my AOL profile with HTML. And so I believe that a lot of people around the elder millennial age, they expect buildings to be smarter than they are. And so it's pretty cool when we can get it right. And right now it might take a lot of analysis, collaboration, coordination, and time, like money spent on getting things to work exactly how we want them to. But I would like to see that become the norm in the next 10 or 20 years, where the buildings are smart, they're giving two-way feedback, between the building and the occupants.
With that, I feel like it's a good time to jump into our exercise, our fun exercise for the day, let's call that. So what we're going to do is walk through a day in the life of a digitized and decarbonized building. And I want to hear from you guys as we go through this, where we're at, what are the challenges, what are the potential opportunities for making that a better experience? Like you said, two-way communication, Kat. So who wants to kick us off? What's the beginning of the day in the life?
I can jump in. So the way that we've kind of laid this out, I feel like especially on the experience technology side, folks have been thinking about this one for a couple of years. I've seen it in my time with Host at CBRE, and just kind of the way that everyone else has built this up. So start from the beginning of your day. You wake up in the morning, and initially a series of decisions you have to start making. After the last 2.5 years of a pandemic, this has become even more strong of a use case. Where am I going to work for the day? And that decision, as we go through this exercise, will have some significant impact on carbon footprint, on productivity, and all of these things that kind of all swirl together. So what has been interesting, there have been I've seen a handful of startups pivot toward this sort of the two-way communication that Kat is talking about, of helping to socialize and plan for, am I gonna work from home? Am I gonna go to a co-working space? Am I gonna go to a physical office? And for me, the most exciting part, the most useful part, has been the socialization of everything. I mean, if you I live in the Midwest or somewhere in the North where we get snow, and in the old days of 3 years ago, we would be sending emails or texting like members of our team of, hey, it's supposed to snow 6 inches tomorrow, so I'm probably not going to come in. I'm not going to plan to have any in-person meetings in that case with James or with Kat. Whereas today, what I'm starting to see more of, and is kind of exciting, is to have an app or something in a calendar function to show like, hey, tomorrow you've got a meeting with James and with Kat, and you're both planning to come to the office. You've signaled somehow, either through an email, through a calendar or something, that you're all coming. That helps make that decision for you. I think there's a degree of social proof, which anytime you go to a bar, the tip jar always has a few dollars in it. It's intentionally so because it's, oh, cool, then I'm tipping too. In this case, the social proof part is two of my colleagues that I work with are going to a physical space. I should go too. And that makes it even more interesting. It's more collaborative that way. So I would start with, what's the decision when I get up? Am I working from home? Am I going into a building?
Yeah. And the first thing I think of when you say that is what happened during the pandemic, right? When all those people made those decisions, hey, I'm not going in for good reason, right? Our buildings didn't respond to that in any way. So you mentioned the sustainability aspect. I can't remember what it was, but there was a lot of data around buildings dropping their energy use, either not at all or very little, right? And so from a sustainability standpoint, I feel like the building of the future is going to need to be able to then operate itself based on that data that comes in, right?
Yeah, spot on. It's the ability to, as we talked about a little bit in the intros, of eventually a building learning its own occupancy. After the first month of the pandemic, in a perfect future state, that building or that portfolio would have started to learn from patterns to say, oh, well, it's been a month and nobody's coming in, so I guess I don't need to be at 72 degrees and 40% humidity 7 to 5 all day anymore.
Yeah.
Definitely. People are going to be checking the weather. They may also be checking the indoor air quality. In our office, we have an indoor air quality sensor, and I'm able to check it easily on my phone. I can tell when the landlord starts ventilating the building. And so I adjust my daily schedule based on when I know there will be excellent indoor air quality in the building.
That's funny. So I'm wondering how that works technically, right? So what does your reading say at, say, 7 a.m. versus how do you know when it's time to go in?
So I edited my story a little because I'm a night owl, and I was literally going into the office sometimes at like midnight, but that just sounds a bit much.
Gotcha.
I'm gonna stop talking now.
Well, I think that's an important aspect of it, is like people use the office in different ways, right? The office of the future, the digitized, decarbonized office of the future, right?
Yes. Right. And I would go to a co-working space at night, but I didn't have the data. So it's like, how much data do you want to share with the occupants?
Interesting. Yeah.
That could be its own separate podcast topic. If you're putting things in the parking lot / bike rack, James, I've had that conversation for probably the last, that goes back to the lead days of the heyday of probably 15 years ago. We would talk to certain building owners or chief engineers to say, this city of Chicago, city of New York are starting to require that, you need to publish how efficient your buildings are. And a lot of them they just go like this. They'd wrap it up. They don't want to share with people because there's a certain degree of assumption of risk on some people for right or wrong. Like, I'm hearing similar conversations with folks that I've talked to in the last couple of years around indoor air quality data. And I mean, to Kat's point, like, I'm the same way. I've got this little AirNet 4 thing that I've been taking everywhere, literally everywhere. It's been if this thing turns red, I get out. I leave the building, full stop. Or go open a window or something. So I think there's a lot to be discussed still around, I mean, for all of this kind of day in the life we're talking about, how much data can and should be shared about a facility that a large group of people go into, especially now that a lot of people, not just we fans and IAQ nerds, everybody wants to know what's in the air. And I think there's a lot of conversation around how much are a lot of buildings willing to share.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect maybe potential. I'll start to make a list of themes that we can maybe summarize all this at the end. But where my mind went to when you guys started talking about that was, what does this technology that needs to provide this look like? Because you have all these inputs on one side and you have these outputs on the other side, which are scheduling the right rooms, potentially HVAC modifications. Like, there's a piece of technology here that we're talking about that sounds pretty complicated compared to a lot of the basically applications that we have today, right? So I think that's maybe one thing that I would throw out there as a potential theme later. Unless you guys have seen this happening where all of these things we've talked about are active in a building somewhere.
It's very rare. And I'm sure if you ask that question in one of your sessions or in a podcast like this, you'll get a handful that'll say, oh yeah, we can do
that
80% of that. Right.
Yeah.
Or in theory, the product is there, but it's the execution piece that I don't think we're at scale yet.
Totally. One thing before we move on to the next step in the day is you mentioned social proof, and I have to call out the book behind you, Influence. Definitely recommend that one. If no one knows what social proof means, definitely check out the 6 Weapons of Influence. Okay, what's the next step in the day here? We're deciding to go to work. Is that what we're deciding?
Yeah, let's go to an office, for old time's sake. So I think something I'd be curious to Kat's take on, how do we get there? And there's some assumption for this exercise of, do you live in a major city, or are you further out in the suburbs? Each of your possible choices is going to have a carbon impact. And from a technical perspective, certainly things that could be arranged through a technology, but I am more curious, Kat, your take from kind of the broader ESG policy approach. How are companies thinking about, like, do they care if I ride a bike or if I drive my Hummer, or what are going through conversations you're having?
We definitely care. As sustainability professionals in real estate, we want to enable people to make choices that are good for the environment and convenient. So it starts with picking a building that has amenities, such as being next to public transportation, having adequate bike racks. And then some companies are providing showers with very nice amenities, similar to a fancy gym, to get people to bike to work. It's something that we think will start to be included more and more in the carbon emissions calculations that companies are calculating as part of their reporting. And so where you locate your building, which can be influenced through a green leasing criteria, which we're seeing gain popularity, can definitely help people get set up so that they can get to work in a way that doesn't involve a single occupancy vehicle, which typically is the most polluting.
Can you explain that connection between the green lease and the location of the building? How does that work?
Certainly. So some companies have hired JLL to make a list of items to look for in buildings. So they're obviously looking for a location where there's talent, but they also may look for things like being next to public transportation, having increased ventilation in the building, areas for EV charging stations, rainwater capture, because a lot of companies have really ambitious goals around water efficiency and carbon reduction. So the base building that they may go into as a tenant really enables them to achieve those goals. Got
it. Makes sense.
That's super compelling to hear that a lot of those things you mentioned, Kat, proximity to public transportation, enhanced ventilation. I feel like those have been kind of core staples of both LEED and WELL over the last 5-10 years. And to hear that there's now a hook financially within a lease agreement to do it, that feels like that will drive some change. It's not just, just not to oversimplify or disrespect, it's not just a LEED seal or the WELL logo on your front door. If that's in your lease, that's got some power, I would think.
Okay, so how do we get to work then? Will there be some sort of technology that will tell us which way to go, or what's the tech stack, or what's the future building going to do for us in this regard?
I think ideally there's a handful of things, and all depending on which mode you take. I think there's going to be a point in time where a lot of the things Kat is talking about will roll into this, anticipatory building or destination of the future, where you may get prompted to say, if you are driving, here's the most sustainable, least carbon emitting route to go. Otherwise, here's suggestions, here's the next train, here's the closest bike or scooter rental thing that all have just kind of hooks into all these other systems. I've seen a handful of startups who have done this pretty well over the last couple of years, to the point that they can start kind of nudging people of, hey, this public train is going to be within 2 stops of your house in the next 10 minutes. You should leave now. So it's more of the behavioral nudge that I think is, with pattern detection with a number of systems all tied together, that's where it's going to start to, kind of leverage these ESG and carbon goals to help kind of, push people in the right direction, if you will, of take the bike or take the train instead of driving your car. And then once you do get there, any number of automation in terms of until you drove your car, parking, in terms of what's the closest space. Do we have EV chargers on site? Can we kind of direct people to those spots as well as a lot of the amenities Kat's talked about with showers and bikes. I think there's a lot to be done there as well, in terms of managing the occupancy. Like, if everybody is going to ride their bike in because it's 65 outside and everybody comes in at 8, there's going to be a line. So some element of, maybe kind of stagger people as they come in, or just give them a notification to say, showers are super busy right now. Unless you plan on going straight to your meeting super sweaty, go ride another mile. And by the time you get here, everybody should be out of the way. So it's more, I see it as just kind of leveraging all these different various technology platforms to kind of give people context more than anything, and allow them to make decisions for themselves, as well as keeping an eye on, this is what my carbon footprint is going to change because of what I decided to do.
Yeah, and similar to how if you put your running shoes and your clothes right by the door, or right when you get out of bed, you're more likely to go exercise. If you could have that nudge where when you walk over the threshold of your door, it says, hey, public transit is coming in 1 minute, or biking, you haven't exercised in X days. If you bike, it will be beneficial for you, giving you that nudge so that you make the decision that's healthier and more sustainable.
What is the overlap between the types of use cases we're talking about here and tenant or workplace mobile applications?
I think it's very similar. To be candid, a lot of what I'm pulling out of my brain are from just being in that space the last 5 years.
Yeah,
it's what a lot of those platforms have either already moved to or are starting to move to. Just, it's going to be an open marketplace at a certain point. Like, if you have a transit app that's hooked into every public transit and all the ride shares, we need a container, put it into a single place. It's kind of like your traffic control for all these different services.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are different camps on the privacy side. I would welcome an automation that said, you have these meetings that are within 2 miles of each other and you don't have anywhere you need to go far away after work. So go ahead and take your bike.
Mm-hmm.
But other people may want more privacy and say, I will run all those analyses in my head on my own.
Yeah.
Hey guys, just another quick note from our sponsor, Nexus Labs, and then we'll get back to the show. This episode is brought to you by Nexus Foundations, our introductory course on the smart buildings industry. If you're new to the industry, this course is for you. If you're an industry vet but want to understand how technology is changing things, this course is also for you. The alumni are raving about the content, which they say pulls it all together, and they also loved getting to meet the other students on the weekly Zoom calls and in the private chat room. You can find out more about the course at courses.nexuslabs.online. All right, back to the interview.
All right, so there was one other thread that I forgot in the middle of that I hope comes back to me, and maybe I'll come back. But what's our next step after we get to the office?
So we've arrived at the building through any number of ways to get us from point A to point B. We kind of skip through, just getting in through security. Maybe there's a gym that's on site. Some folks like their workout first thing in the morning. I think the next area that Kat and I had kind of wanted to anchor on it is more around food in the building. So either, kind of a large Class A multi-tenant where there's a giant food court or things going on in the lobby, or if it's a corporate occupier and they provide breakfast or lunch or coffee bars or what have you. I think there's a couple ways to look at it from kind of the energy perspective on the engineering side. A lot of those type facilities are going to have to start finding ways to adapt from more gas-powered kind of source of heating and cooking food to a lot of where the carbon-free push is moving is focused on electrification. So if those are not currently ways that any food provider or restaurants or even the coffee shops, if they're leveraging natural gas for ovens to heat things up, then that's going to be a pretty significant infrastructure challenge, I would think. Kat, I know you've got many thoughts around the food service side from an ESG perspective as well.
Well, I love when food is something that ties into the community. I don't like walking into an office building and feeling like I could be anywhere. I love when there's some education about local honey or vegetables from community supported agriculture. I see that as a way of real estate being more inspiring. At our offices, we have beehives, and it's something we point out on a regular basis to visitors, and everybody seems to think it's really cool. In addition, it's some of the best honey you can get, and it helps fight allergies. So nice. We really like the food being something that builds community, not something more bland that you could find anywhere.
I love it. Yeah, the both of those things are super interesting. Those different threads are interesting. The community building and the electrification piece, and I think the cooking on the electrification side, I think there's a huge reckoning to be had, not just on the infrastructure, the installing the right devices, but also with the cooks, right? That aspect of, there's this great article in the New York Times around, the perception of cooks needing their blue flames, right? And then, giving them the opportunity to try an induction stove and then seeing how they like it. And it seems like most people get used to it in a couple of days, a couple of meals that they cooked, but it takes that number one, infrastructure, and then number two, behavior change to get over that hump. And I just see that as a huge obstacle when it comes to every appliance, every device that we have, not just the stove, right? But I think the kitchen is where it really hits, like the rubber hits the road, because it's out in front and center of, it's at the core of these people's profession, which is a really interesting aspect of electrification.
I've seen the electrification of cooking go smoothly when it's a new building. For example, there was a multifamily project, and everybody who bought into that building got a set of cookware that worked with the new induction stoves. It was a way to make it really positive.
Interesting. You get this gift, and it's a part of this transition. What about the waste aspect? So I'm reading this book called Waste Free World right now. It's really good book. It's about all these innovations to create a more circular economy. So how about, like, what will the building of the future look like? And it's one of my assignments that I've given myself, is that when I get this book done, I'm going to write something like this. But I'm going to you guys first before I write it. What do you think, from a waste standpoint, the building of the future looks like?
I see a huge educational opportunity with regard to composting. In our offices, we started composting and had a great partnership with a local organization who started to sign their emails. Instead of saying thanks, they said "to building soils," and we were laughing a little bit. And then it was very educational eventually when you thought about it for a couple of days, because you start to see it not as waste, but as a nutrient that goes into a whole cycle. And so I could see an educational component where somebody isn't picking what bin to throw something into, but they are contributing to healthy soils, which then grow healthy food, which nourish healthy people. And some fraction of the population will like that. Another fraction just wants it to be as easy as possible. So you have to build for both.
Right. Totally. Composting is huge. What about the recycling side of things?
I would love if there was more of a national recycling program, because the thing that I'm noticing is that there needs to be education for every region. So if you have a building with the same population on a daily basis, you can educate them But if you have an event facility, it's a little bit harder. For example, if you have a stadium or a concert venue, you need to have really clued in signage that is worded in a way someone can read in an instant. Mm-hmm. So I see the building of the future perhaps have a scanner so that you don't have to do all of that thinking, and you can scan the item and it'll tell you which bin to put it in. I'm not as big a proponent of the single stream recycling. In my experience, that is confusing to people because they think everything is being thrown away. So I like the idea of bringing some technology into it where you can tell what materials are in the product, and that could be an educational moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And those exist, but they're quite expensive now. So I just see them becoming more mainstream.
Right.
I'm hearing a lot of change management. It feels like a lot of these things that are a little new, a little different for people, that, you know, if it's composting, if it's recycling. Kat, to your point around, if something is simple and easy and it's well marked, like I've been in corporate cafeterias or food courts in the past where I have no clue. Like there's a blue bin and a green bin and a regular trash. I don't know what goes where. So I ended up just throwing everything into one spot. Whereas others who have been doing this for a while, and, you know, as you mentioned, what I've seen a lot of the large corporate occupiers, because it's part of their culture. It's just, they have certain ways of doing things, and the people that work there, you know, they just kind of get it. It's just part of their everyday routine. It's much easier to drive that change in behavior than it would be if, you know, the flip side, that again, back to the large Class A multi-tenant, where you've got 50 different companies that all work there. There's no single cohesive culture to anything. You've got people, guests floating in and out all the time. You know, it's a lot harder to drive people there to do things differently, especially around kind of waste management activities.
Definitely. Lately, the best practices I've seen are designing for durables, otherwise known as ceramic cups and plates, so that you're not generating a lot of trash, and then slowly transitioning to using more of the utensils that you could wash and reuse. But there is that bridge step of using compostable utensils. And that's where, in my role, I will facilitate a conversation between the operations and catering team and the design team, because we need to have the right bins, and then we need to buy the right compostable items to have it all work as a system. And oftentimes those people aren't speaking to each other. So that's one of the things I really like about my role, is integrating everything so it works seamlessly.
Interesting. Yeah. The same silos we have today could be there in the future, building of the future, right? So we need someone to kind of go and be that bridge between all the different silos in the organization. Love that. Okay, should we keep going? What's next?
Sure. I think the next real kind of general section that we'd all sort of brainstorm through is, now that you're in an actual building, just the building of the future, supporting the full spectrum of activities that people will go to an office for. And that's going to vary. That's going to vary by person. That's going to vary by team, in some cases by location. There's been a lot of good work I've seen coming out of Leesman, the group who's kind of pioneered this, for lack of a better term, surveys to help understand how people need to use a space, and then also evaluating how that space supports any of the, I think there are 22 tasks that any one person could do in a space, from I have heads down focus work, I need to take a phone call, I need to go collaborate with a whiteboard somewhere, to a video call, all these different things. So I think there's a number of different paths really to think about how that future building, from a tech perspective, as well as from the kind of the broader impacts as well, go about it. Kat, how would you think about kind of overall space use? Where does that land in your world?
We're noticing a trend that's termed flight to quality. Companies may have less square footage per person, but the square footage they do have is very, very high quality. And then other companies have more actually space per square foot, because they're moving to more of those big open social areas with amenities to draw people back into a collaboration space. I see the office of the future being more social, because people will perhaps work remotely when they're working on a spreadsheet, but then when they're working out some complicated problem, more and more I see people wanting to get together and go through ideas. I've also personally noticed that interviewing for new hires, you can use real estate as a recruiting tool, because you show, if you have a mother's room that is immaculately designed, you're showing your values by implementing that. That's part of the S in ESG. And then people can get a feel on the social proof side. If there are all these awesome people that you see walking through what we call the social hub, you may be more likely to work there. It's not just salary, it's a big chunk of your life. So having that real estate be part of your recruiting tool, getting HR to comment, human resources to comment on the design of a space so that it can be used as a recruiting tool.
Interesting. And how does, so when I think of this, I think of the decision making that goes into it too. So Drew, in that sort of tenant app world or that occupier app world, like what are some of the capabilities of those sorts of applications that are sort of handling some of this today?
Yeah, so I think table stakes this year are everything of the basics, from passively helping someone explore the space, to borrow Will Ferrell from SNL verbiage, to understand, of those many tasks that you have to do throughout the day, what is the right place to do the right work at the right time for my own needs. And for a lot of people, especially more of the legacy building stock, that there's no technology built in anywhere. I feel like we've all felt the pain of, I need to go take a phone call and I can't do it out in the open space. So even though just doing laps, you physically walk around the floor plate looking for a quiet place. Whereas the state of either mobile apps or web apps, or I think we're getting more into an automated place where a calendar is starting to recognize to say, you don't have anyone invited to this meeting coming up soon. Do you need a phone room? Do you need a small huddle space? Just to start to kind of drive that, to say, we want people to have choice, and the technology needs to be able to help people explore what their options are. Because I think it's not always obvious. We don't always have, Kat and I both work at commercial real estate companies. So generally our offices are designed with how we strategically advise clients. So, I think if you walk in any one of our offices, especially those kind of a newer design to the last few years, there's no shortage of place to go collaborate with somebody. And it could be, let's go sit down and have a coffee and just kind of casually chat. We need a whiteboard, we need a video screen, any of those things. The real interesting pieces to me as we look forward from just helping people utilize space is not only learning from how they do current state, and that's been around and has really matured probably the last 3 years, of just the traditional, the IoT sensor, if it's passive infrared for did someone use this room or not, just kind of on or off, to even deeper into, if we think about a conference room as an example, are people using it, yes or no? If they are, how many people are in the space? That kind of level 2. And then even further, which kind of begs the data privacy question that Kat alluded to, what intent are people using the space? Are they using any sort of video presentation? Are people using the space more often than not for whiteboarding and kind of brainstorming? Or is it primarily, is there a 10-seat conference room that the same 2 people use it to make phone calls 3 times a week? It really, it drives this sort of, if we can better learn from how people leverage space, that in turn helps us design space to support them better in the future. And then eventually where we get to is the building starts to learn this on its own. And if the building, the sentient being, if it can understand occupancy trends over time to the floor, to the space level, it can start automatically scheduling things on its own. So we talked a little bit earlier around, in the pandemic, buildings that they didn't learn enough to recognize that 5% of occupants were there. I think in the future, we're going to start seeing If I have 10 floors on a building automation system, and eventually sensors throughout the space start to figure out that every Tuesday we only need 2 of those floors, the building's not going to ask. It's just going to shut down 8 of them and message everybody to say, hey, you had a meeting scheduled on the 5th floor. Well, we're not going to open that floor today. So we've rebooked you down to the 2nd floor. Just go there instead. So eventually, and it's a process. We'll get there, but eventually the building just makes those decisions for us to find the optimal occupancy on its own.
Totally. And is there like an intermediate? Because like it's making that decision based on I'm trying to minimize my carbon emissions given how you guys are using the space, right? So there's like the automation aspect of it that could be a little bit farther in the future, hopefully not. But is there an intermediate step that's like, you can book this here, but if you book this here, this one is the lower carbon option? Is that maybe an intermediate step that's more of a tenant engagement piece? I also asked, like, do I really want to be bothered with that when I'm trying to get my work done at the same time, though? I think that's a tough, you're balancing 2 different outcomes that you're trying to accomplish at the same time there. It's interesting.
I love the idea from an educational perspective, and some major airlines are doing that now, and it sparks a wider conversation for researching what's causing it to have lower carbon emissions.
Totally.
I like that concept. I think if just giving people the context and the option to choose the lower carbon footprint perspective. I mean, I do some development on the side, and some of these, the larger platforms, Google Cloud, Azure, AWS, some of them have started to flag, and GCP does this on its own. If you have to pick which data center you want to run your code base out of, they'll put a little leaf next to each one that is their highest performers in terms of carbon. And because it really makes no difference in many cases, like I'll pick the one with the leaf every single time.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot there that we just talked about. We talked about space utilization. We talked about engaging the tenant. We talked about building automation on the back end. It really seems like that section of the day, right, is the most ripe for technology to sort of facilitate all these different outcomes at the same time, because, and this is what I always say, like kind of like that, the challenge between the 2 different outcomes we're going for, us humans can't manage that level of a problem. There's too many outcomes that we're trying to go for there. And so that piece to me feels like the biggest, there's the biggest need for technology there that we talked about so far.
Agreed. I think it's a building is a system of systems with hundreds, if not thousands, of competing priorities. The fact that, to your point, James, there are some times where you just want to get your work done, and it really doesn't matter what the impact is. Stuff is critical. It's got to happen. And the opportunity for technology is to find the way to balance all of those needs to make sure, hey, occupants, we still got you. You're good. You've got your space that you need. It's comfortable. However, we're still going to make sure that we're taking care of all the commitments on the energy and the carbon side as well, because people can't do it on our own. There's no way.
I don't want to add a more complicated piece or factor into this, but Kat, before we hit record, you were talking about there's an equity and inclusion aspect of this as well. Can you take us through that? Not to make it more complicated, but to say this is a really important piece of it as well.
We've noticed that the size of conference rooms can directly impact the ability of early career professionals to get exposure to the type of meetings they need to progress in their career. And so in that way, having more of the bigger rooms where people can sit in and listen on an important meeting contributes to equity and inclusion, and having a larger cohort of those individuals who may not be represented at the highest levels of organizations, allowing them to be in the meeting and get those skills, communication skills, more of the soft skills by being included in those meetings, because it's very common nowadays that there's an important meeting and a number of people can't sit in because the room is too small. So we've seen the size of rooms directly affect the ability of people to access information and mentorship through attending meetings. And that's something I was educated about first with the Candida building, which I did not work on, but it was a very important living building in Georgia. So that's where I first learned about that concept.
Interesting. So, and obviously we can't have a massive conference. We can't have every meeting held in an auditorium, for instance, and we don't want everyone attending every meeting. So it's more, balanced looking at all of these types of inputs.
Right, and there are opportunities to use technology to share space. So having some sort of option to pay $10 per hour per person to get access to a bigger meeting room. So maybe you don't have to have it on your real estate books so that you don't have to pay for a bunch of conference rooms, but perhaps having more community sharing of those large meeting spaces so that they're not sitting idle too much. But then when you do have those meetings where it would be valuable to have a larger audience sit in, that you can include them.
Fascinating. Okay, Phil, what's next? I feel like we're covered most of the day. What else we got?
One thing I noticed is that different people on my team have wildly different desires for heating, cooling, and daylighting. So there could be an aspect where if you're picking to meet at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday with Sue, Joe, and Bob, you find out what their preferences are and you sit in the room that is most in line with their preferences. That it also speaks to perhaps the feedback that the operations facilities managers could give to design teams, because we have one meeting room in our office that has the best sunshine in it and it's full 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And that's where you might have the infrared sensors and the anonymized data, and then also marry that with some of the more narrative feedback that would say, this is why I like this room, because it can be a little nuanced, and then incorporating that into the design for the next office. So there's continuous improvement.
And that's that last point you made, Kat, around incorporating that into design. I think there are a lot of things that, this one in particular, about personalization of indoor environmental quality, of just space experience in general, that at a certain point, all the technology in the world is not going to be able to facilitate for every single person inside the space, unless as a core requirement of that next space, of that next building, you build into the mechanical systems, the daylighting systems, your glazing on the windows, controllability of all these things. You build that in to say, we want to be able to provide a diversity of space, not only from how amenities are organized and seating capacities and intent and all that, but exactly what you're describing of, we need to be able to have, for lack of a better term, a chilly room or like a bright room, just kind of that has been a well point for the last several years as well. Is we gone are the days of every room and every floor is 72 degrees flat, full stop, because that's not how people find comfort. It's different for everybody. So I think it's both. I think it's going to be, design has to have that intent, that focus of, we need to be able to support as many different combinations as possible. But then the technology is there as well, harkening back to memories at Comfy of taking in that personal direct feedback in order to kind of get the spaces to a place where it's, we know that, Kat, here's a room that meets your learned preferences. Perhaps you should book more of your meetings in this room, and then you'll be happy. And then the system can learn everybody else as well. So it's going to be a little bit of both.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm not hearing from you guys is like, here's exactly how the office will be designed. I'm hearing more of, this is the data that we're going to collect to aid the design process, which is interesting, because if you think about the data collection piece, I mean, Drew, you were talking about occupancy sensors earlier, where we had, passive infrared to begin with. And then now I think we have the ability to start to say, these people are whiteboarding using the data coming from an occupancy sensor, which is interesting to think about how much needs to change from the occupancy sensor hardware and analytics that we're providing today. Because right now it's just hit the API, and give me a count of the number of people in this room. It's not hit the API and give me their activity today, which I don't think a lot has to happen for it to change to get to that point, which is interesting to think about in the future.
Yeah, I think technically on that point, technically with computer vision and the state of cameras right now, it's possible. It's the broader implication of, I mean, that
the privacy
requires
aspect.
Oh, big time. That's not quite facial recognition, but it almost kind of is, because you're running code to detect humans and the fact that they're moving, and that's not a place that we socially or legally, I think, are there yet. So yeah,
because as soon as you know that they're whiteboarding, you also know what else they're doing other than whiteboarding. Are they slacking off or whatever? That gets into a serious privacy concern for sure. Okay, what else do we have? Continuing on our day.
I think we're to the point. I think we reverse the process. I mean, we assume that the day is over, and exactly what we talked about at the top of, what is the most sustainable, efficient, meets my needs way to get back home or back wherever I happen to be going. I think that's where it kind of ties up.
I think one piece I feel is missing from the day that we just walked through is, I used to work at this co-working space, and they had a catchphrase or saying, they called it serendipitous collisions. Like, you didn't know who you were going to run into, right? And the ability to run into someone and say, do you want to grab lunch? Or just the ability to just meet new people and run into people is an aspect where, yeah, it can happen, but does it happen in every office? Does it need to happen more? Probably. And can technology help with that? What were we going to say, Kat?
I don't know about technology helping it, but just classic running into people in the staircase and in the elevator has led to a lot of fruitful relationships with me. So I'm a big person who loves cities, because the more people you have, the more often you're going to be running into smart people. We've seen some architecture firms intentionally design staircases so that they have large landing areas, assuming that you are going to run into somebody, and be able to have that serendipitous interaction. And that's somewhere where it'd be cool to use a technology to see if that is an occupied space.
Interesting.
I would look at it as, I think it's space design, space layout. I mean, a lot of the CBRE spaces that I go to where I run into people are intentionally designed for that purpose. Generally, it's in the Chicago office. We have a big place called the Heart, and it's intended to be the heart of the office. And every single path from all of the heads down workspaces, the big sweeping staircases, they all end in the same spot. So you're just by statistics and probability, you're guaranteed to run into more people just because that's where we walk. From a tech perspective, I almost see it more indirect, to the point of if your office has the technology that best supports what you need to do, and that gives you confidence to come in more frequently and gives other people confidence that they will have tech support, but the technology from the building to enable their work, that's going to bring you there in the first place. So I think it's both. It's the design of the space intentionally and I've heard a similar phrase from a friend in the co-working world of, they're in the business of fostering serendipity, and that stuck. Like, I heard that 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that combination of space and just give me a place that I know is going to support me, we're going to run into each other more often than not, and that's great.
I like it. Yeah, we don't have to have a tech solution to every problem. Okay, let's talk about themes here then, assuming our day is kind of winding down. The themes I heard, so Kat, you said education like 50 times, which is like, I feel like that's one of the main themes that we're hearing here, is like, we need to, number one, engage occupants and then educate them on the changes that need to happen in the building, and change management goes along with that. Another theme, you guys interrupt me if you want, but another theme is around privacy and sharing data, and whether we're going to share data and whether we can get to the outcomes we're looking for while maintaining privacy, it seems like. And I think after talking to both of you for the last, this session and then our prep session, the main thing I'm hearing is like, we have to get to where the industry views these things as interconnected. It's not we're going for sustainability and we're doing space planning and we're engaging the occupant with an app. Like all of this feels, as we're talking about this, feels like it's coming together into sort of one holistic vision. Whereas it feels like the history of our industry is like this, like single-minded, headlights view on one problem at a time.
Yeah, that all resonates. It's why I think conversations like these are more important in terms of the workplace itself has become more of a product than it has in years past, in that it has to continually iterate, it has to get better, it has to now win people over, whereas 3 years ago it was a default, and now it has to be designed and operated as a destination to attract people to come in. And the only way to do that is to approach all sides of it. It's all of the things that traditionally, to your point, get talked about from a technology perspective, but it's also policy and sustainability and everything else, kind of the nuances, if you will, that are super important that people may not always notice, but they start to appreciate once they're there.
Absolutely. Kat, you have any closing comments?
It's funny you caught on to the theme of education, because everyone in my family is in education except for myself.
But you are too.
Right. Because you can have all the technology in the world, and then the users are the ones who may be able to implement it successfully. So that's why it's so important to have discussions like this and stick with it, so that we can have those buildings that are smart and help all of the occupants stay healthy and sustainable.
Absolutely. All right, let's close with Carveouts. So Carveouts are what book, podcast, TV show, movie, could be from your personal and professional life, would you recommend the audience checks out? I'll go first. So Luis Monger from Schneider Electric recommended that I check out Severance, and it's a show on Apple TV Plus. Drew's raising his hands. I just wanted to bring it up in this conversation because it ties so heavily to the dark side. It's like the anti-day in the life. It's like the dark side of going to the office, right? I enjoy exploring the dark side a little bit, although I feel like I couldn't sleep last night, and I watched an episode before bed. And so I feel like it hurts my heart a little bit to watch it, but I still choose to do it and want to finish the series.
It's so good. Dark is a good way to put it. When you get to the season finale, let's talk.
Okay.
I've got thoughts.
All right, sounds good.
Oh man. So my Carve Out is another podcast in addition to this one. I'm a huge cybersecurity fan. So I listen to a show called Darknet Diaries,
cool,
which is this guy named Jack Rhysider who interviews, like somehow he gets hackers from, all walks of life, some of whom have been to prison, gets them to come on and tell them a story. And some of them will make you sit up in terms of like, how have I not had my bank account stolen just yet, knowing that these brains are out there. But Darknet Diaries. Cool.
Highly recommended. All right. What about you, Kat?
There's a fantastic podcast called ESG Insider by S&P Global, and it's posted weekly with a special guest talking on a deep dive topic related to ESG. So one week it could be greenhouse gas emissions accounting. Another time it could be the supply chain for a certain type of metal. I find it fascinating. And then I'm reading From Green to ESG by Matt Ellis, the CEO of Measurable. It's really good.
Cool. Yeah, he has a great Cretech talk, a demo day talk on that concept from Green to ESG, which I really enjoyed. Yeah, I'm excited to check out that book as well. Well, thanks for those. Those are great recommendations, and thanks to you both for coming on the show.
Likewise. Thanks for having us.
All right, friends, thanks for listening to this episode of the Nexus Podcast. For more episodes like this and to get the weekly Nexus newsletter, which, by the way, readers have said is the best way to stay up to date on the future of the smart buildings industry, please subscribe at nexuslabs.online. You can find the show notes for this conversation there as well. Have a great day.